The Congressional Progressive Caucus just backed a bill that would bring a 4-day work week to the states, something that other countries across the pond have been toying with. Countries like Iceland conducted several large-scale trials of a 4-day work week. Researchers say they were, quote, an overwhelming success, with many workers shifting to shorter hours without affecting their productivity, in some cases even improving it. It also revealed an increase in workers' mental health. Chair of the Progressive Caucus, Democratic Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, said in a statement, for far too long, workers across this country have been forced to put in longer hours as their wages barely budge.
The bill, dubbed the 32-Hour Workweek Act, comes at a time of labor rethink in the United States after decades of wage decline has been highlighted by the pandemic. Team Rising is here to discuss. Nabila Islam is a political strategist and former congressional candidate in Georgia, and Liz Wolfe is an associate editor at Reason. Welcome to you both. And so Liz, what do you think? I'm all for it, and I feel like the kind of labor market itself is pushing in that direction. There was a story, I think, in the New York Times yesterday about how some schools are actually now starting to close on Fridays to try to keep teachers, which from a parent's perspective is horrifying, from a worker's perspective is delightful. If that's the direction workers are headed, then it seems like as a society we need to kind of prepare for that so that you could hire more people so that workers could work 4 days, but you could still have enough workers to handle all of the needs of the business or the school or whatever the public responsibility is.
Well, I think we're seeing a few things, right? I mean, it's being termed the Great Resignation right now. And there's also this trend that's been happening in China for a while that now we think is sort of trickling into the US called lying flat. The concept, though, with the Great Resignation is that we're basically seeing early retirement for a lot of older workers spurred by the pandemic, as well as some younger workers, sort of younger millennial, mid-aged millennials. So I'm talking people in their 30s who are basically deciding that their working conditions aren't what they want and that they want to take some time off or switch careers. A little bit. Not in favor of the fact that this is being, seemingly mandated or that there's a push to make it forced. I think it's perfectly fine if companies want to opt into this type of thing. But I would also sort of turn our attention to the fact that our job reports are not good. We're struggling to bounce back from, the pandemic. We're seeing, unprecedented amounts of inflation. I mean, for October, the number was 6.2% compared to October 2020. We're in really, really bad shape. We're in dire straits, and I'm not sure that reducing people's productivity even further will be the thing that will make us, a country that succeeds with a highly developed economy that can, continue to be wonderful for many decades into the future.
Yeah, Nabila, I want to ask you about, Liz made a distinction that I think is important in that I think this is probably a great idea for certain companies and they will increase productivity, and it sort of depends on how your workforce is organized and what you do and all of that stuff. At the same time, there are now jobs where you can't clock in at 9 and punch out at 5 because we have smartphones and email and texting where people are just being battered by work responsibilities morning and night to the point where they don't have private lives. Everything is all the same thing. And that applies to jobs sort of across the socioeconomic spectrum. So, Nabil, my question is, federalizing this, do you think that's a good idea, or do you think that this should just become more of a normal thing that certain private businesses decide to go with on their own?
I think that, I support what the Progressive Caucus is doing, and Congressman Jayapal, and this bill is definitely necessary because, as we've talked about, work productivity has increased and our wages have stayed stagnant. We have worker burnout. Americans are sick and tired of these long hours and being paid poorly. And we're seeing this right now during the pandemic that folks don't want to work these not so great jobs that don't respect their work-life balance. So I think that the implementation will be key. I think it can be a gradual thing that finally becomes the norm where we do have a 4-day work week. And as we've seen in Iceland, productivity has stayed the same. What has increased is happiness. And I think more than ever, what we've learned is we need to focus on our mental health because burning us into the ground is not going to solve anything. We can always, we should be working smarter, not harder.
Right, Liz, and by driving people into the ground, like Nabila said, what you've actually done is driven millions of people out of the labor force. They're like, you know what, if this is what it is, check, please. I'm out. So if you reorganize it around people's productivity and their happiness, rather than just trying to squeeze every second out of their lives that you can, do you think you could actually kind of paradoxically encourage more people to come back into the labor force if they feel like it's actually there for them, rather than trying to just extract value out of them?
I feel like, you're right. I'm no Randian objectivist. I'm not going to make the case for that at all this morning, maybe some other time. But I do think it is perfectly reasonable for companies to react to the fact that their workforce is burnt out on their own. The thing that I really object to is, any sort of government intervention that mandates that. I also do think that we're not paying attention to the other side of it. It is important to consider the impact on individuals. But the other side of it is legitimately, like, we are dealing with crazy inflation every single time, Biden and Congress work together. It seems like every 3 months he passes another $1 trillion bill. Now we have legislators contemplating Build Back Better. We just passed an infrastructure bill. Before that, there were coronavirus relief bills. It is worth considering what happens when the bill comes due. And I know that's sort of a cliched, hackneyed libertarian point to make, but I do think it is important because sometimes we're the only ones in the room who are basically saying, hey, this decrease in productivity, this increase in, or rather this, all of the decrease in jobs numbers, the rise in inflation, the absolutely obscene amounts of government spending, where does this lead us? What does this look like in 2030? And so I have yet to hear a sort of good, satisfying answer about that. And, stuff like this that would potentially mandate that companies, only have workers in the office for 4 days a week really, really begins to concern me for that reason.
Although a significant driver of that inflation, besides the fact that you're comparing kind of a depressed moment in 2020 to a reopening economy in 2021, is the collapse of infrastructure, the supply chain crisis. And so we have people who are not connecting the two different things here. So if prices are going up because you have an infrastructure problem and you have a supply chain crisis, the idea that you're going to hurt that by spending money on infrastructure, on improving infrastructure, doesn't make sense. Some spending actually is anti-inflationary, is deflationary, and I think actually a lot of the Build Back Better Act is the same. It'll drive down the price of prescription drugs, drive down the price of healthcare. So it's a little too simple for people to say, well, you're spending money and therefore that's going to drive inflation. No, sometimes disinvesting in the economy makes things fall apart, and then after things have fallen apart, it's more expensive to get things done.
I disagree with your assessment of the Build Back Better bill, but I totally agree with you that supply chain, pressures are a big part of what we're seeing right now with our current sort of economic moment. I do also think you're totally right in terms of comparing 2020 numbers to 2021 in terms of inflation, but it is still worth, acknowledging, and I think we can all agree that the inflation that we're seeing is pretty unprecedented, the likes of which we last saw basically 30 years ago. We're not quite at that level that they ultimately hit. I think inflation ultimately got up to 14%, something obscene. But I do think it is worth noting that it's not just the year over year increase that's concerning people. It's also compared, when you compare 2019 numbers to 2021 numbers, we're still seeing these same trends. So I do think you're right with the caveats, but I do want to add that in.
So last question, Nabila, do you think this is something we're taking much more seriously because we've just gone through nearly 2 years of the pandemic where people really were, there was this very serious forced rethinking of the way that people work. There are so many people that realized they can wake up at 7, do their work and get done with it at 6, and then maybe they don't need to be on from 9 to 5 on Friday. Do you think that 2 years where we had this complete explosion of our sort of norms in terms of what work looks like in this country, do you think this is something that people like the Progressive Caucus are taking much more seriously now because the norms have shifted in the culture?
Absolutely. I think these past 2 years have given people the opportunity to really spend time with themselves and realize what they want, what they don't want. And it's been a unique time for people to, assess, whether they want to work 40 plus hours a week, and are they actually even working all those hours? Sometimes you don't even need that many hours to get your work done. And so you're just being forced to sit in an office and you're watching the clock tick down to 5 o'clock, and you're spending time away from your families. I think a lot of people realize, hey, I like being with my family. I want to continue to spend time with my family. And people have had enough. Like, no, we can't continue to have an economy that's at the expense of the dignity of workers. And, when I was a little kid, my mom worked longer hours because her wages were so low. I didn't get to see my mother a lot. And I think that was and a lot of people are, experiencing that, where they're like, I don't want to stay away from my families anymore, because children need their parents and folks want to spend more quality time at home. But also, if we can continue to have the same productivity, why not have a 32-hour work week?
Singing Emily's family value song.
Yes, exactly.
There you go.
Nabila and Liz, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you, guys.
Of course. We'll have more Rising for you right after this.